The day my husband told me his affair child could wear my daughter's clothes was the day I knew our marriage was over. He said it so casually, like it was the most reasonable suggestion in the world. He stood in the doorway of the spare room with his hands in his pockets and said the words without flinching. I remember staring at him. Not with anger, not right away. With something closer to disbelief. The kind that comes when someone says something so wrong that your mind refuses to process it at normal speed. He was looking at my daughter Lily's storage boxes. The ones I had filled carefully over 7 years. Her school dresses. Her birthday outfits. A small yellow cardigan from her first day of nursery. A coat given by her grandmother 6 months before she died. He wanted to give those things to the child he had made with another woman. What he did not know was that before the end of that week, every item in those boxes would be gone. Not to her. Not to anyone he had decided they belonged to. He would open the wardrobe 3 days later and find it empty. The look on his face when he did, I had prepared for many things that year. But that moment felt like the first clean breath I had taken in months. My name is Saren. I had been married to my husband Declan for 9 years when everything changed. We met when I was 24 at a work event in the city. He was in finance. I worked in communications. We had the kind of beginning people remember, easy conversation, a first date that became a 6-hour evening neither of us wanted to end. We married 3 years later. We bought a house on a quiet street. We had Lily 2 years after the wedding. She arrived in March, small and loud and completely certain of her own importance from the first hour, and I loved her so immediately and so completely that it rearranged the whole interior of my life. For a while after that, 4 years or so, things were good. Not perfect. No marriage is. But steady and warm and full of ordinary happiness that you only understand fully after it is gone. Declan worked long hours. I had returned to work part-time. Lily started nursery and then school. We had routines and rituals and a life that looked, from any angle, like a life that was working. I had no idea what was running alongside it. I had no idea that while I was building our life carefully, something else was being built just as carefully in a different direction. I found out on a Thursday in October. And the knowledge, when it came, arrived all at once. The signs, when I looked back later, had been there. Declan started coming home later. 2 or 3 evenings a week. He arrived after Lily was in bed, which had not been his habit before. He was on his phone more. Not secretively. He did not hide the screen or leave the room for calls. But there was a new distraction to him. A quality of being present in body, while somewhere else entirely in mind. I mentioned it once. He said the team was under pressure on a new account. I believed him, because I had no reason not to. His behavior toward me did not change dramatically. He was still kind in the surface ways. He asked about my day and sat beside me in the evenings. But something underneath had shifted. A warmth that had always been reliable became less so. Some evenings it was present, and some it was not, and I could not find the pattern. I told myself it was the new account, that it would ease when the project delivered. I was very good that year at telling myself things that kept the shape of my life intact. The shape did not hold, but I did not know that yet. I kept doing what I always did. I made Lily's lunches and answered my work emails and went to bed beside a man I thought I knew, and I believed what I had built was solid. I found out on a Thursday in October. Lily was at school. I was working from home. Declan had left his personal laptop open on the kitchen table. I was not looking for anything. I was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps the right place, depending on how you understand these things. A message notification sat on the screen. I saw it before I could look away. For words from a contact I did not recognize. I stood in the kitchen for a very long time after reading them. My tea went cold. Outside the window, the garden looked exactly as it had yesterday. Nothing around me had changed. And everything had changed. I did not confront Declan that day. I needed to be certain. I needed the full picture before I spoke, because I knew, with bone-deep precision, that once I said something there was no going back. I spent 3 days gathering what I needed to know. I kept Lily's routine completely normal. I kept my expression steady. And inside I was doing something that felt less like grieving and more like preparing. I did not cry those 3 days. Not once. The grief would come later, and it would be significant. But in those 3 days, I was entirely focused. Like a person who has spotted something dangerous and is moving very carefully and very deliberately until they reach safe ground. I confronted Declan on a Sunday evening after Lily was in bed. I had made dinner. We had eaten normally and talked about ordinary things. Lily had been funny at supper, doing an impression of her teacher that made us both laugh. In the middle of that laugh, I felt the full weight of what was about to change, and I breathed through it. After Lily went up, I sat at the kitchen table and told Declan what I had seen. He did not deny it. I had half expected denial. But he looked at the table, and after a moment he said her name. Trisha. She worked at his firm. It had been going on for 14 months. 14 months. I repeated that number back, and he nodded without looking up. I asked if it was over. He said yes. He said it had ended 2 months earlier, and that he had ended it because he wanted to fix things with us. That he had already made the decision before I found anything. As if coming back deserved credit when the leaving had never been acknowledged. I told him he needed to sleep in the spare room. He did not argue. He got up quietly, said goodnight in a voice I had never heard from him before, and went upstairs. I stayed at the table for a long time after that. The house was very quiet. Lily was asleep, and I sat alone with 14 months of a life I had not known was happening. 3 days later, Declan told me something that made the first conversation feel simple. Trisha had been pregnant. The baby had been born 4 months earlier. A girl. I sat very still. For months. Our daughter was 7 years old and asleep upstairs, and 4 months earlier another child had been born from my husband's choices, and he had said nothing. For 4 months, he had come home to this house and sat at this table and put Lily to bed and said nothing at all. I asked why he was telling me now. He said Trisha had contacted him asking for financial support. He felt I should know because it would affect our finances going forward. The right thing to do, he said. Asked how old the baby was when he ended the affair. He was quiet. I did the arithmetic. He had ended things when Trisha was around 2 months pregnant. I asked if he had known. He said he had not. I was not certain I believed that. I am still not entirely certain. What I was certain of was that the past 14 months had just expanded into something much larger. The man across the table from me had been managing a version of his life I had not been given access to. And the child born from that hidden version was real and 4 months old, and was now part of the facts I had to live inside. I did not speak again for a long time. In the weeks that followed, I made decisions carefully. I spoke to a solicitor. Not with immediate intention to file for anything, simply to understand my options and my legal position. Knowledge felt like the only fully controllable thing in a situation where everything else was shifting constantly beneath me. I also started seeing a counselor for myself. Not couples work. Not yet. I needed somewhere to carry what I was holding that was not visible to Lily and not available to Declan. Declan was contrite. He did not minimize or argue or try to reframe what he had done. He answered questions directly and accepted the spare room arrangement without complaint. He was present with Lily in the way he had always been, which was both a relief and its own particular kind of pain to witness. I set rules during those weeks. Trisha would not come to this house. The affair child would have no connection to our family's daily life. Declan would manage his financial obligation to that child separately, and it would not be discussed in front of Lily. He agreed to everything immediately and without negotiation. I thought that meant he understood what the rules were protecting. Some weeks later, I would discover that agreeing to rules and understanding their depth were two different things. That the words can be right while the comprehension underneath them is still forming. The moment that revealed that gap came on a Tuesday in December. My counselor was a woman named Dr. Anwin. She had a calm office near the city center and a way of asking questions that made you feel you had arrived at the answer yourself. In our third session, she asked what I was most afraid of. I told her I was afraid of Lily being hurt by something she had played no part in creating. Everything else I could work through. My own grief, the damage to what I had believed about my marriage, the particular loneliness of discovering a parallel life. All of that I could carry. I had processed hard things before. But Lily was 7. She understood that Daddy was sleeping in the other room but accepted my explanation without pressing. She was trusting and her world was still largely intact. Keeping it that way felt like my primary responsibility. Dr. Anwin said something in that session I wrote down afterward. She said, "The way you protect your child is not by keeping everything perfect. It is by being steady when things are not perfect." I came back to that sentence many times in the months that followed. On the harder days, it was almost the only thing I could hold clearly. I was not trying to pretend everything was fine. I was trying to be the kind of steady that made fine possible for Lily. Those are different things. The first is dishonest. The second is the hardest kind of love. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in December. Lily was at school. I was working from home. Declan had come to collect papers from the house, and I heard him on the stairs. He appeared in the office doorway and said he needed to talk quickly. I saved my document and turned to face him. He said Trisha had messaged that morning. The baby, her name was Maisie. The first time he had said her name in front of me, had outgrown most of her clothes. Trisha had asked whether he could help with some things. I waited. Declan looked briefly toward Lily's room. "Lily has things she's grown out of," he said. "Boxes in the spare wardrobe. She doesn't use them anymore." I thought maybe Maisie could.
"No," I said.
One word. No raised voice. He blinked. "It's just clothes, Saren. Stuff Lily doesn't wear." "No," I said again. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said he had to get back to the office. I heard the front door close. I turned back to my screen. And I sat very still, looking at the document I had been working on before he arrived, the words on the screen meaning nothing, thinking about what had just happened. He had looked toward Lily's room. He had thought about her things. And, in that thought, he had placed Maisie. That was the thing I could not leave alone. I want to explain what happened inside me in the hours after that conversation. On the surface, what Declan suggested was small. Old clothes. Things Lily had outgrown, sitting in boxes she never opened. The practical argument could be made easily. They were not in use. Someone needed them. But that argument missed everything. Those clothes were Lily's history. The green dress she wore to my sister's wedding at 4 years old. The star pajamas from her 5th birthday. The coat from her grandmother, kept not because Lily would ever wear it again, but because getting rid of it felt like releasing something I was not ready to let go. These were not inventory. They were not resources to be allocated. And the fact that Declan had stood in the doorway and looked toward our daughter's belongings and thought about Maisie, that told me something no conversation had yet told me clearly. It told me that in the deepest part of his understanding, he had not separated these two lives the way I needed him to. That somewhere in his mind, the practical management of his consequences had started to blur boundaries that needed to stay sharp.
He did not see it.
I know that now. It was not deliberate. But unconscious blurring of boundaries is not less harmful for being unconscious. It just means the conversation needs to go deeper. That evening I decided what I was going to do. That evening, after Lily was asleep, I moved her things. I went quietly to the spare room and opened the storage boxes. I went through every item. The green dress. The star pajamas. The grandmother's coat. Dozens of other pieces, each with a memory attached. I folded everything carefully and packed it into clean Ziploc bags. I worked for 2 hours, moving quietly so Lily would not wake and Declan, downstairs watching television, would not hear. When I finished, I carried the bags to my car. The following morning, while Declan was at work and Lily was at school, I drove to my parents' house. My mother opened the door, looked at the bags in my arms, and asked no questions. She was that kind of woman, and I had always been grateful for it. We put everything in her spare room closet. She made tea. We sat at her kitchen table, and she held my hand across it without speaking. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. Not happy. Not healed. But lighter. Because something that should not have been at risk had been removed from risk. I had not argued. I had not explained at length. I had simply acted in the way that made the position clear without requiring Declan to agree with it first. The things belonged to Lily. They were now somewhere only Lily and I could access. That was enough. Declan noticed the following evening. I heard him upstairs around 7. Lily was at the kitchen table doing a fractions worksheet. I was sitting nearby with a book. I heard the spare room door. Then the wardrobe. Then silence. He came downstairs a few minutes later.
The boxes, he said.
Lily's old clothes. They're gone. I looked up. Yes. Where did they go? Somewhere safe. For Lily. His tone was careful. Something pressed down underneath it. Saren. I nodded very slightly toward Lily, who had not looked up from her fractions. He closed his mouth. He went to the kitchen and stood at the counter with his back to the room. Then he said goodnight to Lily, who explained her fractions worksheet to him in great detail, and went upstairs.
We did not speak about it that night.
But I felt his knowledge of what I had done sitting in the house like something solid. Tomorrow it would surface. I had prepared for that. What I had not prepared for was how different it would feel to wait for that conversation from a position of having already acted rather than from a position of arguing about whether to act. The ground felt different, more certain, like the weight had shifted to a place where I could hold it steadily rather than just carry it with effort. I slept better than I had in weeks. The conversation happened the next morning after Lily had gone to school. Declan came into the kitchen and closed the door. He stood across the table from me. I need to know what you did with Lily's things, he said. I moved them somewhere Lily can access them when she wants to, I said. They're safe. Why? Because you stood in the doorway and looked toward Lily's belongings and thought about Maisie, I said. And I am not willing to leave anything of Lily's in a position where that thought becomes an action. He was quiet for a moment. Those things were in boxes, he said. She doesn't even know what's in there. That is not the point. The point is that they are hers, part of her history, and you calculating how her belongings could be used to manage the consequences of your affair is something I will not have in this house. He sat down. I wasn't calculating anything. It was a practical thought. Yes, I said. That is the problem. It was only practical to you. To me, it was everything else.
He was quiet for a long time.
I think something arrived in him during that silence that earlier conversations had not delivered. Not because I had said something new, but because I had already acted, and the action had given the words a weight they had not carried before. He called me selfish 2 days later. Not that morning. That ended in the long quiet, and then he left for work. The word came on Saturday, when the conversation surfaced again. He said he had been thinking about it, and felt my response had been excessive. The clothes were not in use. Maisie was a child who had not asked to be born into these circumstances. Making a point at a child's expense was not what he expected from me. I listened to all of it. Then I said, I am not making a point at Maisie's expense. Maisie has a mother who can clothe her. You have a financial obligation and you are meeting it. Maisie's needs are being handled through the right channel. It was not just anything. You had an affair. You had a child with another woman. You came home and said nothing for 4 months. And then you looked at what belonged to our daughter and thought about how it could serve the situation you created. He said nothing. If that feels like selfishness to you, I said quietly, then we have a much larger problem than a wardrobe of old clothes. He left the room. I sat at the table alone and thought about the word selfish, the way it had been used, as a tool to reframe my boundary as my failing. I had seen that move before in other contexts. I recognized it for what it was, and I let it pass without taking it in. The argument about the clothes became the argument about everything. That is the nature of the thing that has been building for a long time. One moment releases the whole accumulation. The clothes were not the cause of anything. They were the opening through which everything already there finally came through. Declan said he felt I had never truly accepted that he wanted to repair things. That every decision I made was designed to punish him. I told him I had no interest in punishment. If I had wanted to punish him, I would have done far more than move storage boxes. What I wanted was clarity about who we were, about whether we were, in any real sense, still building toward the same life.
He said he wanted to be.
The problem with sincerity in a moment is that it is not the same as consistent behavior across time. He had been sincere on the Sunday I confronted him. He had agreed to every boundary. And then he had looked at Lily's wardrobe and thought about Maisie without understanding why that was the very thing I needed him never to do. That was not cruelty. It was a failure of deep understanding. And a failure of understanding is in some ways harder to address than deliberate wrongdoing. Because you cannot simply ask someone to stop doing something wrong. You have to help them understand something they have not yet seen.
We were not there yet.
But we were, at least, talking about the right thing. I had a session with Dr. Anwin during this period that stayed with me. I told her about the clothes and the conversation and the word selfish. She listened without expression. Then she asked, "What do you think he was really asking when he suggested using Lily's things?" I thought carefully. "Acceptance," I said. He wanted me to treat the two situations as equivalent. Maisie's needs and Lily's things. As if agreeing to that meant I had accepted everything. And had you accepted everything?
No.
Not in the way he needed me to. Do you think you will? I can accept that Maisie exists, I said. She is innocent. But accepting her existence is not the same as accepting no boundary between her world and Lily's. Those are different things. Declan was treating them as one. Dr. Anwin wrote something down. "That distinction is very clear," she said. "Has Declan heard it stated that directly?" "Not yet," I said. "I think he needs to." I went home that evening and told him exactly that. Using those words, the distinction between accepting Maisie's existence and accepting no boundary seemed to reach him differently than anything I had said before. He was quiet in a new way. A listening quiet rather than a defensive one. That was the first time I had felt something shift in him that I believed was real. 3 weeks after the clothes conversation, Declan asked if we could try counseling together. I had expected the question. I had been thinking about my answer. I told him I was willing, but that before we sat in any room together with a third party, he needed to understand what the actual problem was. Not the affair. Not Trisha or Maisie. Those were facts we would carry. The actual problem was whether Declan could understand that his choices had created a permanent line, and that line needed to be respected permanently, not managed until things felt easier again. He said he understood. I told him understanding it in a conversation was different from living it consistently over time. He said he knew. We started couple sessions 2 weeks later with a counselor named Dr. Carver. His office was quiet, and his questions did not allow comfortable hiding behind polished answers. The sessions were hard. Genuinely hard. The specific discomfort of being seen clearly and having to respond to what is seen rather than what you prefer to present. Declan showed up to every session. He was not defensive in the way I had braced for. Something had changed in him since the clothes conversation, since the exchange with Dr. Anwin's framing had passed through our kitchen. The shifting I had noticed was continuing. I was watching it carefully. I was not ready to trust it yet. But I was watching. I want to tell you about Lily during this period, because she was the center of everything. Every decision I made was made with her in mind. Every morning I made sure her breakfast was normal and her school bag was packed and her world looked as it always had. That was not pretending things were fine. It was being the steady presence Dr. Anwin had described. She noticed things the way children notice, not with adult analysis but with a body that registers atmosphere. Some evenings she was quieter. She asked once if Daddy was sad. I told her grown-ups had complicated feelings sometimes and that he loved her very much, which was true regardless of everything else. She drew him a picture one afternoon. A house with 4 people and a sun in the corner and flowers taller than the figures. She gave it to him after dinner. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he asked her to explain each person, and she did so in great and earnest detail. I watched his face during her explanation. Whatever he felt in that moment was the truest thing I had seen from him in a long time. Not performed. Not strategic. Just the full weight of what he had put at risk arriving in him through a child's drawing of 4 stick figures in front of a house. I hoped it stayed with him. For Lily's sake, mostly. But I hoped it stayed. 4 months after the clothes conversation, Declan asked if I thought we were going to be okay. We were in the kitchen after Lily was asleep. He had made tea, which had become his way of signaling that he wanted to talk rather than argue. I had noticed this shift and found it useful. He sat across from me and asked the question directly. I told him honestly that I did not know. The answer depended on things I could not yet see clearly. On whether what I had been watching in him over recent months was genuine change or the performance of change. Those things look similar from the outside for a while. Only continued behavior separates them. He asked what he could do. I told him the same things I had been saying since October. Be consistent. Treat the line as permanent. Never again look at Lily's life and calculate how it could absorb the consequences of his choices. He said he had not done that consciously. I told him that unconscious behavior does not care about intention. Only impact matters. He was quiet. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Saren." Not the way I said it before. Something different this time. I looked at him across the table. "I know," I said. "I can tell the difference." And I could. After months of watching closely, I knew what performed remorse looked like, and I knew what this was. It was slower, more uncertain, less polished. It was the real version. I told my mother about the counseling on one of my visits to her house. She listened the way she always did. Without steering, without opinion until I had fully finished. When I was done, she asked, "Do you still love him?" I thought about it properly. "I love who he was before I knew this," I said. "But I am not sure that person and the one I am living with now are the same. And I cannot love this version the same way until I understand who he actually is." She nodded. "That is an honest answer," she said. "It is the only kind I have left," I said. She refilled my cup. "What does Lily need right now?" she asked. "Stability," I said immediately. "For the house to feel safe. For both her parents to manage something difficult without making her responsible for any part of it." "Are you managing it?" "Yes," I said. And I meant it. Some days managing was the only thing I was doing. But I was doing it every single day. For Lily mostly. But also for myself. Because the alternative, collapsing into the grief of it, disappearing into what had been lost, was not something I was willing to give this situation. It had already taken enough. My steadiness was not something it was going to have. 6 months after discovering the affair, I made a decision about the future. There was no single dramatic moment. No final conversation that tipped the balance in one clear direction. It was more like a slow accumulation of clarity. The way fog lifts not all at once but patch by patch until you can see the landscape plainly. I had watched Declan carefully across those 6 months. In the counseling sessions. In the kitchen. At Lily's bedtime. I watched how he handled conversations about Trisha's arrangements and whether he mentioned Maisie in front of Lily, and whether the line I had drawn stayed where I put it or shifted when it became inconvenient. The line held. He had not tested it again after the clothes conversation. Not from fear of me, but because I believed the weight of that conversation had finally delivered something earlier conversations had not. A real understanding of what the boundary was protecting and why it needed to stay. I decided to stay. Not because I had forgotten. I had not and would not. Not because trust was fully restored. That would take much longer than 6 months. But because what I had watched long enough and closely enough to believe was real. And because Lily's world was better with 2 steady parents inside it than with the fracture of separation. I made that decision for myself, as much as for her.
I want to be honest about that.
It was not sacrifice. It was a considered choice made with open eyes. I want to be clear about what staying meant and what it did not. It did not mean the affair had been absorbed as something we were past. It did not mean acting as though the last year had been a difficult patch that was now behind us. Maisie was a child. She was innocent of every adult decision that had led to her existence. I had no anger for her. What I felt when I thought about her was a sad clarity. A child had arrived into a complicated situation through no fault of her own. She deserved to be cared for. Declan was doing that, and I would not obstruct it. What staying meant was this. I had chosen to rebuild on entirely new terms. Not on trust that had been repaired, but on a new trust built from nothing. Slowly. With full visibility. No assumptions and no shortcuts. Declan understood this. Dr. Carver had helped make the language precise in ways that direct conversation had not always managed. We were not the couple we had been. We were two people choosing deliberately and with open eyes to become something new. Whether we would succeed was a question only time could answer honestly. But we were asking it, both of us, without pretending the asking was easy or the outcome guaranteed. And that honesty, that specific, unglamorous, uncomfortable honesty, was something I had not expected to find on the other side of that October Thursday. But it was there. And it was more solid than almost anything that had come before it. The clothes were still at my parents' house. About 8 months after I had moved them, I went to collect them. Not because all risk had passed, but because keeping them away felt like maintaining a defensive position I no longer needed to hold. I brought them home and put them in the spare room wardrobe. Different box, clearly labeled with Lily's name. I told Declan I had brought them back. He looked at me for a moment. I think he understood what the gesture meant. Not forgiveness completed. Not the conversation closed. But a signal that I was no longer moving through the world braced for the next mistake. He said thank you. I told him he did not need to thank me for returning things to where they belonged. That evening Lily found one of the bags while looking for something in the spare room. She pulled out the small green dress from my sister's wedding and held it against herself in front of the mirror on the door.
I was so tiny, she said.
You were 4, I told her. Did I look nice? You looked exactly like yourself, I said. Which meant you looked wonderful. She put the dress back carefully.
She was 8 now.
Her world was intact. Her parents were managing something difficult without making her carry any of it.
She was fine.
She was going to be fine. That was the thing that mattered most. A year after everything came to light, I thought often about what the clothes had actually meant. Not as a symbol, just as an object in a story. A practical thing that had become the container for something much larger, because of the moment it was mentioned. Declan had not asked for the clothes because he was deliberately cruel. I want to say that clearly. He had asked because he had not yet arrived at the full understanding of what the line between Lily's world and Maisie's needed to look like. He was managing too many consequences at once, and he made a practical calculation in a moment that called for something else entirely. The thing about practical calculations is that they are not always wrong. But there are moments when a practical thought reveals something about where a person's mind is, about what they see as connected and what they see as separate, about which people in a room they are most trying to accommodate. In that doorway, looking toward Lily's things, Declan had been trying to accommodate Maisie. Not out of preference. Out of guilt that did not know where to place itself. I understood that now. Understanding it did not change what I had done or why. But it made the whole thing feel less like a wound and more like a necessary moment. A moment that said what needed to be said without either of us fully intending it. Sometimes the smallest thing reveals the biggest truth. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. Which is both the difficulty and the gift. It's been 14 months since the Tuesday Declan stood in the doorway and looked toward Lily's things. Lily is 8 years old. She is loud and funny and entirely certain of her own opinions, which she inherited from me and which I consider a gift. She does not know the full story of the past year. She will, when she is old enough to hold it. I have thought carefully about how that conversation will go. Declan and I are still in the house on the quiet street. We are not the couple we were before October. We are something different, more deliberate, more careful in the ways that matter, less willing to take ordinary good days for granted. The line I drew has held. Not because I am watching for it every moment, but because Declan eventually understood what it was protecting and why it needed to stay where I put it. That understanding did not come from any single conversation. It came from all of them together, and from the action that gave the conversations their weight. Some of the most important things I have ever said were said quietly in a kitchen with my hands around a cup of tea. Not shouted, not performed, just said, plainly and completely, to someone who eventually learned to hear them. The clothes are back in the spare room. Lily's name is on the box. They are hers. They have always been hers. And they will be there, untouched and whole, until the day she decides what she wants to do with them. That was never negotiable. It still is not.